Hello everyone, this is the third video in our Monopoly series. And in this video, we're going to be directly building off the material that we developed in the last video in part 2 to talk about which quantity and which price a Monopoly firm will choose to maximize their profits. Because we learned, that the goal of any firm, whether it be a perfectly competitive firm or a monopoly, the goal of any firm or business from an economist's point of view is to maximize profits. So thinking back to how a perfectly competitive firm maximizes profits, if you remember, we drew out our marginal revenue and marginal cost curves. And we know that to maximize profit, the perfectly competitive firm is going to choose the quantity and the price where marginal revenue is exactly equal to marginal cost. So on the graph that I drew here, we see that at this intersection point, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, this is going to be the quantity that the perfectly competitive firm produces. And this is going to be the price that they charge. So it's pretty straightforward to find the quantity and the price that maximizes profits for a perfectly competitive firm. Now, we know that for a monopoly, the marginal revenue curve looks a little bit different. So finding out what the quantity and the price is involves a couple little extra steps, which we'll go through right now. So whenever we're trying to find the quantity and the price that maximizes the profit for a monopoly, we're going to have these couple extra steps like I just mentioned. But there is one similar step for calculating or finding what quantity maximizes the profit for a monopoly when we compare it to finding the quantity for a perfectly competitive market. And that step is, a monopoly maximizes profit by producing the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So whether it be a perfectly competitive firm or a monopoly, the firm is going to maximize profit by choosing a quantity where the marginal revenue that they bring in from producing that quantity is exactly equal to the marginal cost of producing that quantity. So let's say that a monopoly was producing at a quantity where the marginal revenue that they were getting from that quantity was greater than the marginal cost that they were incurring from making that quantity. So the money they're bringing in from that quantity is bigger than the money it's costing them to make that quantity. What does that mean? Well, the monopolist could step back and say, hey, I'm bringing in more money than what it's costing me. I have room to sell a little bit more product, thereby bringing in extra money. That adds to my profits. So if the marginal revenue was greater than the marginal cost, they would increase the quantity that they make up until a point. If they start increasing quantity until the marginal cost starts to get bigger than the marginal revenue, if the money that they are, incurring to make that product at that quantity, if it's costing them more than what they're bringing in, then they're producing too much and they're like, oh, maybe we should cut back to a point exactly where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So it's kind of like that output effect and that price effect we talked about in the last video. Those two kind of have to balance out. And it doesn't matter if it's, you know, a perfectly competitive firm or a monopoly, choosing that quantity is exactly the same. The difference between finding the price and quantity for a perfectly competitive firm and a monopoly differs by what price these two firms can charge. So finding the quantity is exactly the same. The price is going to be a little bit different. So because a monopoly is the only firm in the market selling this particular good or service, they basically can set the price to the highest price consumers are willing to pay for that quantity. So not just setting the price at the marginal revenue, they can set the price even higher than their marginal revenue. They can set the price all the way up to consumers' maximum willingness to pay. A consumer's maximum willingness to pay can be found along the consumer's demand curve. So if we were to kind of draw this out, we can see that doing the profit maximizing price and quantity, or finding those two values, is going to be slightly different whenever we're dealing with a monopoly here. So referring back to the last video, we know that the marginal revenue curve for a monopoly is not a horizontal line like perfect competition, it's downward sloping. So the marginal revenue curve looks like this. For a monopoly, it's also going to be important for us to draw out the demand curve. So remember, the demand curve always lies above the marginal revenue curve here. Both are downward sloping, but the marginal revenue curve is half of the slope of the demand curve. The marginal cost curve is going to look exactly the same between a perfectly competitive market and the monopoly. So marginal cost is just going to be upward sloping. If you refer back to your notes and the lecture notes when we actually first derived all of these different types of costs, you might remember that the marginal cost curve is the one that kind of looks like a check mark or a J. In this, video and in the lecture notes on finding the profit maximizing price and quantity, we're just paying attention to that upward sloping part of the marginal cost curve just to make things easier whenever we're, trying to find the price and the quantity. It's just to make things easier. So if you remember that it was J-shaped, good job. We're just focusing on that top portion of the marginal cost curve. Okay, so if we have these three curves, we can go right ahead and try to find the profit maximizing quantity and the profit maximizing price for this monopoly. So if you remember what we just went over, finding the profit maximizing quantity is exactly the same as if we were trying to find the profit maximizing quantity for a perfectly competitive firm. So finding the profit maximizing quantity, we go to the point where marginal revenue is exactly equal to marginal cost. Marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect at this point right here. So this would be the quantity that the monopolist will produce to maximize their profits. And like I just went over, if we were at some point over here, we would see that the marginal revenue at this point is bigger than the marginal cost. So it would make sense for the monopolist to want to produce more of the good. But if they produce too much, if they're at a quantity out here, where the marginal cost is bigger than the marginal revenue, the money they're, the money that it's costing them to make these extra goods is bigger than the money that they're actually bringing in, they're going to want to produce less. So the profit maximizing quantity for the monopolist is the one where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Great. Hopefully so far so good. Now, if this was perfect competition, that same intersection point would determine the price. But we know that because the monopolist is not facing any competition, they can charge the maximum willingness to pay for this quantity. So if we are at this quantity Q1, what would be a consumer's maximum willingness to pay at this quantity? Well, we would find that by going up to not the marginal revenue curve, but all the way up to the demand curve. What that means is, if we're at this quantity Q1, at this intersection point, we go up to the demand curve. And this is the price that the monopolist is going to charge for this quantity. So the price is on the demand curve. So we can see that finding the price is just a little bit different. And it kind of makes sense that the price is going to be higher for a monopoly than what the price would be if there were, a perfectly competitive market. So since there's not competition, the monopolist is able to charge this higher price, this maximum willingness to pay, because there's no one else in the market competing with them, kind of forcing them to charge a lower price or anything like that. The monopolist has free reign to charge the maximum willingness to pay. The maximum willingness to pay is represented by the demand curve. So hopefully this makes a little bit of sense. So I guess we can kind of, think about finding the profit maximizing price and quantity for a monopoly in sort of this like 3-step process. So step 1 would be finding the intersection point between marginal revenue and marginal cost. If you get this intersection point where these two intersect, great. You know what quantity the monopolist is going to charge or produce. From this intersection point of marginal revenue and marginal cost, you go straight up to the demand curve at this intersection point to find the consumer's maximum willingness to pay at this given quantity. So, intersection point, you can find the quantity. The maximum willingness to pay can be found straight up on the demand curve. Once you reach the demand curve, you found the price that the monopolist is going to charge for this certain quantity. So again, jumping back into the exact lecture notes, this is what it looks like in the lecture notes. It looks very similar to the drawing that I just did by hand. So again, profit maximizing output is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. From that intersection point, you go straight up to the demand curve to find the person's maximum willingness to pay for that quantity. And that maximum willingness to pay is the price that the monopolist is able to charge for this quantity. You can also calculate the exact amount of profit that the monopolist is going to earn if you include the average total cost curve on this picture. Now, this isn't going to be entirely important for you guys to remember for the exam or the problem set, just due to some of the material that I had to cut out in these lectures and things like that. But if you do remember, we did touch on this a little bit when we went through perfect competition as well. So if you remember with perfect competition, we had when marginal revenue and marginal cost were on the same graph, we added the average total cost curve to see if they were making profits or losses. You can do the same kind of thing with a monopolist here. And again, this isn't too entirely important for you guys to remember for the exam. But just know that you are able to add this other curve in to calculate the exact profit that the monopolist will make. Not just saying they're going to, make this amount and charge this much for it. You could actually calculate the profit. I'm not going to make you guys do this for a problem set or for an exam. This is just in here as kind of like an informational piece for you guys, because the textbook goes into a lot of detail about this sort of thing. But again, decided to cut some of this stuff out for you guys. Okay, so this video is going to end with this little case study that I kind of came up with here. And again, I think is pretty relevant to current events and what's happening in the world right now. And that's kind of seeing how, what does the price and the quantity for a specific good look like if it was produced by a monopolist or if it was produced under conditions of perfect competition. So right here we have a graph that shows the price and the quantity for a typical drug. Let's say the drug is the vaccine for the coronavirus. So we have our demand and the marginal revenue for the monopolist drawn here. So we have our demand curve and the marginal revenue curve being drawn under that at half the slope. The marginal cost, even though it's typically, upward sloping or that check mark shape, to keep things super, super simple for you guys just to get to the, intuition of this example, we're just deciding to keep the marginal cost curve constant or horizontal for now. It'll be easier to see the conclusions of what happens in this example. So, if, a specific pharmaceutical company in the world is the first one to develop the vaccine for the coronavirus, they're most likely going to want a patent on that specific formula. In other words, they're going to, go to the government and request some kind of legal prohibition for no one else to be able to make this specific combination of drugs for the coronavirus vaccine. They're going to want to create this legal monopoly to prevent other firms from profiting from this new vaccine that this company came up with. So, if this company does request a patent on this vaccine, this gives this company monopoly power in the market for the coronavirus vaccine. So, the quantity that this firm produces of the coronavirus vaccine, if they're a monopoly, is where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. So that's how we find the quantity that this firm produces. And the price that they charge is the maximum willingness to pay for that quantity. So the price that the monopoly firm charges for the coronavirus vaccine is this price here. But what happens after this patent runs out? So typically when it comes to patents and things like that, these things usually last a decade or so. So given some amount of time has passed, the patent is no longer valid anymore. What does that mean? That means that other firms will now not be violating the law if they decide to also produce the coronavirus vaccine. So after a certain amount of time, this patent runs out, and now this one firm is not a monopoly anymore. More firms start to enter the market because this barrier is not there anymore. More firms enter this market to produce the coronavirus vaccine. How does shifting from being a monopoly to now being more perfectly competitive impact the price and the quantity of the coronavirus vaccine? So, when the patent expires, the market becomes more competitive, and like generic off-brand coronavirus vaccines may start to appear. So they aren't made by that first company anymore, but other companies start producing that same vaccine. If we were to find the profit maximizing price and quantity for a perfectly competitive firm, we see that the marginal revenue for a perfectly competitive firm is its demand curve, remember. So this is the marginal revenue for a monopoly. Marginal revenue for a perfectly competitive firm is exactly equal to the demand curve. So if we change this to marginal revenue, and let's just say marginal cost stayed the same to keep things simple, we see that at this new intersection point, this is the quantity of the coronavirus vaccine that's going to be produced. And this is the price that the coronavirus vaccine is going to be sold for. So we see that moving from monopoly to perfect competition not only raises the number of corona vaccines available for people to consume, it also lowers the price. Because now that there are more firms out there producing this same vaccine, you know, there's an incentive for firms to lower the price below this maximum willingness to pay. So again, this was just kind of a little simple example to kind of compare and contrast how a market may look when it moves from monopoly to perfect competition. And this will be the end of this video. In the next video, we're going to dive into a new topic dealing with price discrimination.